In this lecture, we will discuss the use of support departments to allocate manufacturing overhead to units produced. This is a refinement of allocating overhead using separate departmental application rates. When we did that before, we divided the factory into departments that produced the products. This time, we will divide the factory into more departments. We will have two types of departments. Just like before, we will have departments that produce products. These departments allocate their overhead to the units that they produce. We will call these departments production departments or operating departments. They are departments that produce the products that the firm sells or the services that the firm offers to its customers. The second type of departments are called support departments or service departments. These departments provide services that allow the production departments to do their job. A firm's human resources department is an example of a support department. The HR department doesn't produce a product or service, but they allow the firm to operate and the production departments to do their job. Another example of a support department would be a maintenance department. The cost to run support departments are part of the overhead of the firm, and support departments allocate the cost to run their department to the production departments. The production departments take that allocated overhead and add it to their own overhead. The production departments then allocate that combined overhead to the products they manufacture or services that they provide. Let's do an example. Assume that a law firm has one support department, which is word processing. It costs $200,000 to run word processing. Word processing allocates its cost to the law firm's two production departments, which are corporate and litigation. Assume that the word processing department provides 60 hours of work to the corporate department and 40 hours of work for the litigation department. One way that the law firm could allocate the cost of the word processing department to the production departments is to use one cost driver. In our example, assume that the word processing department allocates its cost to the production departments using the hours worked as the cost driver. If that is the case, then the corporate department would be allocated 60% of the cost to run the word processing department, and the litigation department would be allocated 40%. A more complex way to allocate the support department's cost would be to use two application rates. With a dual rate approach, the firm would divide the cost to run the support department into its fixed costs and its variable costs. The firm would then allocate the support department costs using two different application rates. For example, assume that a law firm with two production departments uses an online research service like Lexis. The service costs $20,000 and $1 for every hour spent online. The law firm could allocate the cost of the research service by charging each production department $10,000 plus $1 for each hour used. When allocating costs to production departments, the support departments allocate budgeted costs, not actual costs. When allocating budgeted costs, do support departments use the budgeted cost driver or the actual driver? The answer to that question depends on the situation. When allocating fixed costs, the support department should use the budgeted cost driver, not the actual cost driver. Fixed costs represent the cost to acquire and maintain the support department's capacity that it needs to do its job. That capacity is based on budgets, not actual usage, and its cost should be allocated based on budgeted usage. Assume that a law firm rents an adjacent office in order to provide both of its production departments with a conference center that each production department says that it needs. After the conference room is acquired, the litigation department declines to use that conference room. The law firm rented the conference room, in part, because the litigation department said that it would use the conference room. The litigation department should be charged with its share of the rent regardless of whether it actually uses the room. On the other hand, variable costs are allocated using actual cost drivers. Variable costs are only incurred if there is actual activity. There is no cost associated with getting the budget wrong, which was the case with fixed costs. For example, assume that a production department says that it thinks that it will ship 1,000 packages in the next year. Based on that budget, the firm enters into a contract with a delivery firm that will charge the firm 10 cents per mile for each shipment. It turns out that the production department only ships 800 packages. Since the shipping costs are only variable costs, the shipping costs should be allocated based on the miles actually shipped rather than the budgeted mileage. The firm did not incur any costs that resulted from the production department's mistaken estimate of its shipping costs. If the firm is only going to allocate support department costs using one rate, rather than a separate rate for fixed and variable costs, then it is common for the support department to use actual drivers rather than budgeted drivers. Let's do an example. Assume that a firm's copy department budgets that the firm's two production departments will make 500,000 copies each. Based on those budgets, the copy department estimates that it will have fixed costs of $10,000 and variable costs of 1 cent per copy. During the year, Production Department 1 actually makes 400,000 copies and Production Department 2 actually makes 600,000 copies. The copy department actually has fixed costs of $15,000 and variable costs of 2 cents per copy. If the firm uses dual application rates to allocate the cost of operating the copy department to its two production departments, then it would allocate the copy department costs as follows. The firm will allocate the budgeted fixed costs equally between the two production departments, so that each production department will be allocated $5,000 of copy department fixed costs. The budgeted variable costs will be allocated using the actual number of copies. Therefore, each production department will be allocated 1 cent per copy for each copy that it actually makes. So, Production Department 1 will be allocated $4,000 in copy department variable costs, and Production Department 2 will be allocated $6,000 of those costs. In summary, the Production Department will be allocated a total of $9,000 and Production Department 2 will be allocated a total of $11,000. This will leave $15,000 of costs that the copy department will not allocate. This unallocated cost is a manufacturing overhead variance, and it will be added to cost of goods sold if it isn't material as we discussed previously. When a firm has more than one support department, and the support departments do work for each other, the allocation of support department costs can be very complicated. A firm may use one of three methods to handle the issues raised when dealing with this situation. The fact that a firm has more than one support department in itself is not complicated. Assume that our law firm has two support departments, the word processing department and the recruiting department. Assume that it costs $200,000 to run the word processing department and another $200,000 to run the recruiting department. Also assume that the word processing department spends 60 hours working for the corporate department and 40 hours working for the litigation department. In addition, assume that the recruiting department spends 50 hours working for the corporate department and another 50 hours working for the litigation department. This isn't a difficult situation. The word processing department allocates 60% of its cost, which is $120,000, to the corporate department, and 40% of its cost, which is $80,000, to the litigation department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 50% of its cost, which is $100,000, to the corporate department, and another $100,000 to the litigation department. The allocation only becomes complicated when the support departments do work for each other. Assume that the word processing department also spends 10 additional hours working for the recruiting department, and the recruiting department also spends 5 additional hours working for the word processing department. Now, word processing would allocate its cost as follows: 9.09% to recruiting, 54.54% to corporate, and 36.36% to litigation. In addition, recruiting would allocate its cost as follows: 4.76% to word processing, 47.62% each to corporate and litigation. The problem comes from the 9.09% of costs that word processing allocates to recruiting and the 4.76% of costs that recruiting allocates to word processing, as can be seen in the next slide. When the work that the two support departments do for each other is given full effect, the allocation of support department costs proceeds as follows. First, word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After that first round of allocations, word processing finds that it receives $9,523.81 of additional costs from recruiting that it has to allocate to the departments that it supports. Similarly, recruiting finds that it has received $18,181.82 of additional costs from word processing that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves. So, the two support departments allocate those additional costs in a second round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the second round of allocations, word processing finds that it has $865.80 of additional costs that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves, and recruiting also has $865.80 of additional costs that it must allocate as well. So, the two support departments allocate their additional costs in a third round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the third round of allocations, word processing finds that it has $41.23 of additional costs that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves, and recruiting has $78.71 of additional costs that it must allocate as well. So, the two support departments allocate their additional costs in a fourth round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the fourth round of allocations, word processing finds that it has $3.75 of additional costs that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves, and recruiting also has $3.75 of additional costs that it must allocate as well. So, the two support departments allocate their additional costs in a fifth round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the fifth round of allocations, word processing finds that it has 18 cents of additional costs that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves, and recruiting has 34 cents of additional costs that it must allocate as well. So, the two support departments allocate their additional costs in a sixth round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the sixth round of allocations, word processing finds that it has 2 cents of additional costs that it has to allocate to the departments that it serves, and recruiting also has 2 cents of additional costs that it must allocate as well. So, the two support departments allocate their additional costs in a seventh round of allocations. Word processing allocates 90.91% of its costs to the production departments and 9.09% to the recruiting department. Similarly, the recruiting department allocates 95.24% to the production departments and 4.76% to the word processing department. After the 7 rounds of allocations, the word processing department has allocated a total of $210,434.80 of its own costs plus the costs that have been reallocated to it. Similarly, recruiting has allocated a total of $219,130.40 of its own costs plus the costs that have been reallocated to it. After those 7 rounds, the production departments receive a total of $400,000. The extra $29,565.20 that the support departments allocated represents costs that were traded back and forth between the support departments until they were finally allocated to the production departments. The production departments can't receive more than the original $400,000 with which the support departments started. There are 3 alternate ways that firms deal with the multiple levels of allocations caused by support departments doing work for each other that we just observed. They are called the direct method, the step-down method, and the reciprocal method. You need to know all 3 of these methods. With the direct method, the firm ignores the work that the support departments do for each other. With the direct method, the word processing department allocates its costs only to the 2 production departments, and it ignores the work that it does for the recruiting department. It allocates its costs based on the relative driver used on each of the production departments. You calculate the relative driver by adding up the cost drivers for all of the departments receiving allocations. You then divide the cost driver for each department receiving an allocation by the total drivers for all of the departments receiving the allocations. In the case of the word processing department, the 60 hours spent on the corporate department and the 40 hours spent on the litigation department add up to 100 total hours. By dividing the corporate department's 60 hours by the 100 total hours, you calculate that corporate receives 60% of word processing's costs. Similarly, when you divide litigation's 40 hours by the 100 total hours, you calculate that litigation receives 40% of word processing's costs. Therefore, corporate receives $120,000 of word processing's costs and litigation gets $80,000 of those costs. In the case of the recruiting department, the 50 hours spent on the corporate department and the 50 hours spent on the litigation department add up to 100 hours. By dividing the corporate department's 50 hours by the 100 total hours, you calculate that corporate receives 50% of recruiting's costs. Similarly, when you divide litigation's 50 hours by the 100 total hours, you calculate that litigation receives 50% of recruiting's costs. Thus, corporate and litigation each receive $100,000 of recruiting's costs. When you add up corporate's $120,000 from word processing and $100,000 from recruiting, you see that corporate receives a total of $220,000, which it adds to its own overhead costs and allocates to the services that it provides to its clients. When you add up litigation's $80,000 from word processing and $100,000 from recruiting, you see that litigation receives a total of $180,000, which it adds to its own overhead and allocates to its clients. The $220,000 allocated to corporate plus the $180,000 allocated to litigation should equal the original $400,000 with which the support departments started, which it does. The second method to allocate support department costs is called the step-down method or the step method. With the step-down method, the work that support departments do for each other is given partial effect. Each support department allocates its costs sequentially. Sometimes this method is called the sequential method. Each support department allocates its costs to all of the departments that receive their support, including other support departments. After a support department allocates its costs, it drops out of the picture. It never receives any allocation of costs from another support department. In our example, assume that the word processing department goes first. It allocates its costs to recruiting, corporate and litigation, and then it drops out of the allocations. Recruiting then allocates its costs to corporate and litigation. Recruiting does not allocate any costs to the word processing department. Assume that a firm had 3 support departments and 2 production departments. With the step-down method, the first support department would allocate its costs to the second and third support departments as well as the 2 production departments. The second support department would allocate its costs to the third support department and the 2 production departments. The third support department would allocate its costs to the 2 production departments. As suggested by the slide, this method is called the step-down method because the firm goes down the steps from support department 1 to support department 2 to support department 3 when doing its allocations. With respect to our example, assume that word processing goes first. Word processing would allocate its costs to recruiting, corporate and litigation using each department's relative hours. In order to calculate the relative hours, word processing would add up recruiting's 10 hours, corporate's 60 hours and litigation's 40 hours to get a total of 110 hours that it spent on those departments. Now, word processing would divide recruiting's 10 hours by the total hours of 110 hours in order to calculate the share of its costs that it should allocate to recruiting. Similarly, it would give corporate a share of its costs equal to 60 hours divided by 110 hours. Finally, it would give litigation a share of its costs equal to 40 hours divided by 110 hours. Therefore, word processing gives recruiting $18,182, corporate $109,091, and litigation $72,727. Recruiting does not allocate any of its cost to word processing. Recruiting received $18,182 of word processing costs, and it adds those costs to its own $200,000 of costs, giving recruiting $218,182 to allocate to corporate and litigation. The 50 hours spent on the corporate department and the 50 hours spent on the litigation department add up to 100 hours. When you divide the corporate department's 50 hours by the 100 total hours, you see that corporate gets 50% of recruiting costs. Similarly, when you divide litigation's 50 hours by the 100 total hours, you see that 50% of recruiting costs are allocated to litigation. Thus, corporate and litigation each receive $109,091 of recruiting costs. The $218,182 allocated to corporate plus the $181,818 allocated to litigation should equal the original $400,000 with which the support departments started, which it does. There are 2 methods used to decide the order in which the support departments allocate their costs. The first method is the easiest to use and the most popular. You let the support department with the highest costs go first. The second method says that you let the support departments that spend the highest percentage of their cost driver on the other support departments go first. You need to know both methods for the exam. With our example, both support departments have the same amount of costs to allocate, so you can't go by the highest cost. Using the percentage work done for the other support departments approach, you would calculate that word processing spends 10 out of a total of 110 hours working for recruiting, which is 9.09% of its time. On the other hand, recruiting spends 5 out of a total of 105 hours working for word processing, which is 4.76% of its time. Because word processing spends a higher percentage of its time on recruiting than recruiting spends on word processing goes first. In the example shown in this slide, Support Department 1 spends 40% of its hours on the other support departments. Support Department 2 spends 30% of its hours on the other support departments, and Support Department 3 spends 50% of its hours on the other support departments. Therefore, Support Department 3 goes first. When you are trying to decide which department should go second, you need to ignore the hours that the support departments spend on Support Department 3. Support Department 3 has allocated its costs, and it is no longer part of the calculations. You have to eliminate it from your denominator when you calculate the percentage that each support department spends working on the other support department. So, you only look at the fact that Support Department 1 spends 20 hours divided by 80 remaining hours on Support Department 2, which is 25%. Similarly, you would look at the fact that Support Department 2 spends 25 hours divided by 95 remaining hours on Support Department 1, which is 26.32%. Thus, Support Department 2 goes second. The third method is called the reciprocal method. With the reciprocal method, the firm takes into account all of the work that the support departments do for each other. This method is also called the simultaneous method. Although the firm could do multiple levels of allocations as we did earlier, we can get the same result with a little algebra. On the exam, you will only have 2 support departments when you have to calculate the allocations made using the reciprocal method. This eliminates the need to know matrix algebra. When you only have 2 support departments, you first must write the formula that shows the total cost that each support department will have to allocate. That formula consists of the original costs that the support department starts with plus the share of the other support department's costs that it will receive. In our example, use WP to represent the costs that word processing will allocate, and use R to represent the costs that recruiting will allocate. The recruiting department will allocate its own $200,000 of costs plus the share of word processing costs that it will receive. That share is 10 divided by 110. Similarly, the word processing department will allocate its own $200,000 of costs plus the share of recruiting costs that it will receive. That share is 5 divided by 105. Now that you have the 2 formulas, you substitute one of the formulas into the other. In this example, we know that word processing is equal to $200,000 plus R times 5 divided by 105. We can therefore take that formula and substitute it for WP in the first formula. After the substitution, you have a long formula with only one unknown, which is R. You now solve for R. When you solve for R, you get $219,130.42. Now that you know that recruiting will allocate a total of $219,130.42, you substitute that amount for R in the second equation and calculate that word processing will allocate a total of $210,434.78. If you go back and compare the figures that we just calculated to the total allocations that the 2 support departments made when we did 7 rounds of allocations, you see that we get the same amounts of total allocations with a slight rounding error. We will now use those total allocation figures that we just calculated, and have word processing allocate $210,434.78 to the departments that it supports. We will also have recruiting allocate $219,130.42 to the departments that it supports. In order to allocate word processing's costs, you would first add up the hours that word processing spent on each department receiving an allocation. This adds up to 110 hours. You then divide that total into recruiting's 10 hours, corporate's 60 hours and litigation's 40 hours to get the percentage of word processing's costs that are allocated to each of those departments. Thus, recruiting is allocated $19,130.43, corporate is allocated $114,782.61 and litigation is allocated $76,521.74. In order to allocate recruiting's costs, you add up the hours that recruiting spent on each department receiving an allocation. This adds up to 105 hours. You then divide that total into word processing's 5 hours, corporate's 50 hours and litigation's 50 hours to get the percentage of recruiting's costs that are allocated to each of those departments. Therefore, word processing is allocated $10,434.78, corporate is allocated $104,347.82, and litigation is also allocated $104,347.82. In order to make sure that you didn't make a mistake, you should add the $10,434.78 that word processing was allocated to the $200,000 of costs that word processing started with to see whether it equals the $210,434.78 that word processing allocated. It does. You should also add the $19,130.43 that recruiting was allocated to the $200,000 of costs that recruiting started with to see whether it adds up to the $219,130.42 that recruiting allocated. Except for a penny rounding error, it does. The last thing that you should check is to see whether the amount allocated to the production departments is equal to the $400,000 that the support departments started with. Except for a penny rounding error, it does. The end.